I want you to start by just picturing a massive, deafeningly loud ticking clock.
Oh, yeah.
Because the year is 1947, it's March, and the British Empire is just completely exhausted.
Totally drained.
Right. I mean, Britain itself has just suffered through one of the most brutal winters on record. The country's practically bankrupted by the Second World War, and they're still rationing bread.
Yeah, all that.
And right in the middle of this, the Prime Minister in London makes an absolutely staggering announcement. Britain is going to pull out of India, the undisputed crown jewel of their empire, by June 1948.
Which is an insane timeline for a withdrawal of that size.
Exactly. And to dismantle this empire, to serve as the sort of ultimate closer of the imperial age, they send in Lord Louis Mountbatten.
Right.
He is a glamorous, highly decorated scion of royalty. And that ticking clock we mentioned, he's the guy who has to beat it.
It is arguably one of the most consequential countdowns in modern history, really. We're looking at a moment that didn't just end an empire, but permanently rewired the geopolitical reality of South Asia.
Right.
And honestly, the world.
And that is exactly what we are setting out to unpack today. So for this deep dive, we've been going through this massive stack of historical records, declassified archives, and biographies to really understand this frantic, incredibly chaotic 5-month period from March to August 1947.
Quite a stack of reading, yeah.
It really is. And we are going to look at Mountbatten's arrival on the subcontinent, his complex, kind of tangled relationships with the leaders of the Indian independence movement, so Jawaharlal Nehru of the Indian National Congress and Muhammad Ali Jinnah of the Muslim League.
Right.
Plus, we're getting into the incredibly secretive backroom deals that fundamentally altered the timeline of independence and physically partitioned an entire subcontinent.
Because, when you look closely at these primary sources, that conventional narrative of a dignified, orderly British withdrawal, it just completely falls apart.
It totally does. What becomes incredibly clear, and what you are going to see as we go through this material today, is how the fate of hundreds of millions of people was not decided by careful years-long planning.
Not at all.
It was decided by bruised egos, deeply personal friendships, desperate compromises, and just a terrifying rush for the exit.
Yeah, a complete scramble.
So let's establish the board here. Mountbatten arrives in New Delhi on March 2010, 1947. He is stepping in to replace Lord Wavell as Viceroy.
Right. Well,
And Wavell had this incredibly slow-paced withdrawal strategy called the Breakdown Plan, which London had basically just thrown in the trash. So Mountbatten steps off the plane, and it seems like his primary strategy is just overwhelming charisma.
it is a night and day transition. And you really have to understand this contrast to see why it mattered so much to the political players on the ground. Like Lord Wavell was a career military man.
Right.
He was famous for his stony silences, a very rigid reticence, and this almost pessimistic view of the political deadlock.
It's a wall of a guy.
Exactly. He was practically impossible for the Indian leaders to read or negotiate with dynamically. But Mountbatten, on the other hand, was voluble, he was charming and relentlessly energetic. He treated politics a bit like a Royal Naval engagement, honestly.
Wow, yeah.
And he also didn't just come as a new figurehead. He brought an entirely new, highly curated machine with him.
Right, his own team.
Yeah, he brought Lord Ismay, who had been Winston Churchill's chief of staff, and crucially, he brought in a Hindu official named VP Menon.
Oh, Menon is such an essential figure here.
He really is. He was deeply connected within the Indian bureaucracy and acted as a direct, trusted conduit to the powerful Congress leader, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel.
It's just a total charm offensive from day one. And the relationships Mountbatten starts building right out of the gate are fascinating. I mean, he almost immediately develops this deep mutual affection and trust with Nehru.
Yeah.
The historical accounts even emphasize that Mountbatten's wife, Lady Edwina Mountbatten, helped fill an emotional void in Nehru's life, creating this incredibly intimate bond between the three of them.
Which is a huge factor later on.
Exactly. But then you have Jinnah. And the dynamic there is completely different. Mountbatten actually wrote that he found Jinnah abnormal and disturbing, though he did begrudgingly respect his incredibly steady nerve.
Yeah, the personality clash between Mountbatten and Jinnah was profound. Jinnah was a brilliant, very cold constitutional lawyer who just didn't care at all for Mountbatten's aristocratic flair.
Or his backslapping familiarity.
Exactly. Jinnah had no time for that.
But Mountbatten doesn't let that stop him from trying to manipulate both sides. He employs this specific psychological tactic that, well, It feels straight out of a Machiavellian playbook.
It really does.
He wins the trust of the Congress leaders, like Nehru, by privately denouncing Jinnah to them. He essentially says, I know this guy is impossible to deal with. And then he turns right around, walks into a meeting with Jinnah, and wins his trust by privately complaining about how unreasonable the Congress leaders are.
And the really striking thing about this tactic is that it actually worked.
Wait, really?
At least in the short term, yeah. Both sides walked away from their initial meetings, feeling like the new viceroy finally understood their specific struggle. Like he was quietly in their corner.
See, I have a really hard time wrapping my head around that because I picture Mountbatten like a slick corporate fixer brought in to handle a hostile merger.
Right.
He's whispering in the ear of the CEO, then walking across the hall and whispering in the ear of the rival board. I just keep wondering how these brilliant veteran political leaders, men who had spent their entire lives fighting the British Empire, didn't immediately see through this whisper campaign. Were they just blinded by his charisma?
Well, no, it wasn't that they were naive or blinded. If we look at the structural reality of India in early 1947, both sides were absolutely desperate for leverage.
Okay, that makes sense.
And they needed an ally with executive power. You see, the previous British strategy was known as the Cabinet Mission Plan. And that plan aimed to keep India entirely united, but with a very weak central government and incredibly strong autonomous provinces.
Right. But looking at the sources, that plan was completely dead in the water by the time Mountbatten showed up.
Entirely dead. The communal violence across the subcontinent had shattered any trust required for a shared government.
Yeah.
Events like the horrific direct action day in Calcutta the year prior had pushed the country to the absolute brink of an all-out civil war. Both the Congress and the Muslim League had largely accepted that a partition of some kind was the only realistic way out.
So they knew it was coming.
Exactly. They weren't looking to Mountbatten to be a neutral, objective judge. They were actively trying to recruit him to their side to secure the absolute best borders, the most resources, and the most favorable terms for their respective new nations.
So they played along with his flattery because they needed his signature?
Precisely.
Okay, that structural desperation makes a lot more sense. They're using him just as much as he's using them.
Very much so.
Which sets the stage perfectly for how fragile this whole setup was. Because Mountbatten has effectively built these contradictory alliances through back-channel whispers, and the whole house of cards almost collapses. The second actual policy is put on paper.
Oh, the Simla incident.
Yes. In May 1947, Mountbatten goes up to Simla, this hill station, for a rest, and he gets a draft plan back from London. And this is known in the files as the Dickey-Bird Plan, or Plan Balkan.
And this document was absolute political dynamite. The Dickey-Bird Plan proposed transferring power not to one or two central governments, but directly to the individual provinces.
Wait.
Yeah, it would let each province decide independently whether to join a new India, join a new Pakistan, or just stay completely independent as sovereign states.
I read that in the archives and immediately thought, wait, so this would mean India wouldn't just be split in two, it would shatter that glass.
Exactly.
Yep.
And that is exactly why it was nicknamed Plan Balkan. It threatened the balkanization of the subcontinent.
Like Europe before World War I.
Right, where a larger region fractured into dozens of tiny, fragmented, and hostile nations. If this plan went through, you could have had a patchwork of dozens of separate countries across South Asia, each with its own army and foreign policy.
What a nightmare.
And all of Mountbatten's top British advisors explicitly warned him to follow protocol. They told him, do not show this draft to anyone until we have a formal, official meeting with all parties present.
But Mountbatten ignores his entire advisory staff.
Yeah.
He has a quote-unquote hunch. So he secretly invites Nehru to his private suite and just hands him the document to read first.
It's just unbelievable.
And Nehru completely explodes. He sends Mountbatten a furious note saying this plan will lead to the total balkanization of India, creating endless conflict.
Right. He saw exactly what happened.
And Mountbatten has this sudden, terrifying realization that if he had presented this officially to the entire group the next morning, it would have been a catastrophic failure.
He would have lost the Congress Party entirely.
And looked like a complete fool.
It was a massive breach of protocol that inadvertently saved the negotiations, weirdly enough. Once Mountbatten realizes the official London plan is toxic, VP Menon, that crucial Hindu official we mentioned earlier, he steps in.
This is where Menon really shines.
Yeah, Menon literally works through the night to frantically draft a completely new alternative plan.
And Menon's draft is a total pivot. It throws out the province-by-province choice and establishes the framework for just two successor states, India and Pakistan.
But this creates a massive new problem.
Right.
Because this meant creating a truncated Pakistan, where the massive, wealthy provinces of Bengal and Punjab would have to be physically sliced in half to separate the Muslim and Hindu majorities.
And Jinnah had fiercely opposed this idea.
Vehemently.
So how on earth does Mountbatten get Jinnah to agree to a fractured Pakistan?
Well, he resorts to outright coercion. Mountbatten uses a mechanism called the Domitian Plan to threaten Jinnah.
Now, I wanted to ask about this because the threat sounds so bureaucratic on paper, but the sources imply it was an existential threat to the Muslim League. How did the Domitian Plan actually work?
Okay, so the Domitian Plan was essentially a threat of British abandonment. At that time, day-to-day administration was being handled by an interim government.
Which was mostly Hindu-dominated, right?
Exactly. It was a transitional cabinet heavily dominated by Nehru and the Congress Party. So Mountbatten told Jinnah, if you don't agree to this two-state plan with divided provinces, the British will simply pack up, get on our ships, and hand all absolute authority over to the current interim government.
Ah, wow. So if Britain just walks away, the Muslim minority would be legally, militarily, and politically swallowed by a government entirely controlled by their rivals.
Precisely. It was the ultimate ultimatum. Accept a smaller partition Pakistan or risk being placed entirely under the authority of a Congress-led government with zero British protection. It is. And Jinnah, displaying that steady nerve, Mountbatten noted, he recognized he was completely cornered. He couldn't call the bluff. But he held his ground just enough to secure the creation of a sovereign Pakistan, even if it meant accepting borders he felt were fundamentally unjust.
It is just wild to think that a gut feeling, a literal hunch to break protocol and show a secret document to one guy in a hotel room forced a frantic all-nighter that rewrote the fate of millions of people.
It really forces us to rethink how imperial history is made, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Mountbatten was rewriting imperial policy on the fly to appease the Congress leadership. This wasn't careful, step-by-step diplomacy orchestrated from London. It was high-stakes, reactive improvisation. I mean, he abandoned months of British planning over a single weekend because he realized he had misread the room.
Which directly results in the finalization of the June 3 plan.
Right.
It is officially agreed. India and Pakistan will be separate sovereign dominions. The massive provinces of Bengal in the east and Punjab in the west are going to be partitioned right down the middle.
A huge undertaking on its own.
Exactly. But this leads us to what is easily the most shocking twist we uncovered in these archives.
The timeline shift.
Yes. The original publicly announced departure date was June 1948. That was the ticking clock from the beginning of the story. But suddenly, in the wake of this plan, the date is abruptly scrapped and independence is moved up to August 15th, 1947.
Which is barely any time.
They compressed the timeline by 10 entire months.
And to understand the sheer recklessness of that decision, we really have to look at Britain's primary strategic obsession at the time. The British government didn't just want to leave India. They were desperate to ensure that both newly independent nations remained inside the British Commonwealth.
And I'm honestly struggling to see why Britain, a nation that is utterly bankrupt, freezing, and desperate to shed the financial burden of its empire, cares so much about whether these new nations stay in their Commonwealth Club.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive.
Was this just pure imperial nostalgia? Or a desire to save face?
No, it was about survival in a rapidly changing world. The Cold War was just beginning to cast a very long, terrifying shadow over London and Washington.
Oh, right.
Britain wasn't acting out of nostalgia. They were acting out of military strategy. They wanted to secure military bases, particularly deep-water ports and air bases in West Pakistan. Those locations were incredibly close to the Middle Eastern oil fields and directly on the southern flank of the Soviet Union.
That makes a lot of sense.
The British High Command firmly believed that keeping both India and Pakistan in the Commonwealth was the only legal and diplomatic way to ensure defense cooperation, share intelligence, and protect British interests in the Indian Ocean against Soviet expansion.
So they needed a geopolitical anchor.
Exactly.
And that desperation leads to the ultimate backroom deal. VP Menon and Sardar Patel approach Mountbatten with an offer. They tell him that the Congress Party will accept Dominion status, which basically means retaining the British monarch as a head of state and staying in the Commonwealth.
Which is something the Congress had previously sworn they would never do.
Right. But they agree only on one massive condition. The British have to transfer power immediately, in just 2 months.
And Mountbatten eagerly accepts this.
Yeah.
And he does so knowing exactly how impossible the logistics are.
He knew
Oh, absolutely.
that.
We have him on the record comparing the two nations. He said that transferring power to India was like handing over the keys to a permanent, fully functioning building. They had the capital in Delhi, they had the institutional infrastructure.
Right. It was already set up.
But for Pakistan, which had to build a capital, a government, and a military from absolute scratch, he admitted they were just, quote, putting up a tent. We can do no more.
Wow.
He knew he was severely handicapping the new state of Pakistan, but securing that Commonwealth deal to cement his own legacy as a strategic genius was his overriding priority.
I just want to make sure the sheer scale of this is clear to you listening. Imagine trying to execute a massive corporate divorce like splitting up a multinational conglomerate. You have to divide the assets, the bank accounts, the real estate. Now imagine doing that, but instead of paper clips and office chairs, you are dividing the national treasury, the entire railway system, the civil service, and a standing military of hundreds of thousands of soldiers.
Unfathomable.
And you decide to do it all in 73 days, just so Britain can keep its military bases.
The archival evidence points exactly to that level of calculation. The British wanted to avoid the continued financial drain of a long, drawn-out occupation. They wanted to secure their geopolitical flank against the Soviets. And the Congress leaders wanted power immediately, before the communal situation deteriorated further, or honestly, before the British Parliament could change its mind.
So everyone is just rushing.
Yes. Both sets of leaders traded administrative sanity for immediate political wins. And in doing so, they consciously ignored the massive, catastrophic human cost that compressing a nation-building timeline into 10 weeks would inevitably trigger.
And as if the logistical nightmare wasn't enough, Mountbatten's own bruised vanity makes the situation significantly worse.
Oh, the Governor-General issue.
Right, because the timeline wasn't the only thing compressed. The leadership structure was too. Mountbatten fully expected that after independence on August 15th, he would be named the joint Governor-General of both India and Pakistan. He envisioned himself sitting above it all, like this benevolent umpire guiding both nations through the transition.
He had an incredibly high opinion of his own indispensability. He truly believed both sides needed him to function.
But Jinnah wasn't having it.
No, Jinnah was deeply constitutional, and he was highly suspicious of Mountbatten's obvious intimacy with Nehru. So Jinnah decided that no, he himself would serve as the first Governor-General of Pakistan. He wanted to ensure his new nation was truly independent of British influence from day one.
And Mountbatten's vanity is deeply, deeply wounded by this. The sources describe an explosive meeting where Mountbatten loses his temper and actually threatens Jinnah, saying this decision will cost him his assets and his nation's future.
Which is a remarkably petty reaction with devastating consequences.
Because that is the exact moment Mountbatten's mandate of impartiality completely vanishes.
Yep. After that rebuff from Jinnah, you see Mountbatten repeatedly throwing his executive weight behind India in crucial existential disputes.
Right, like when the military assets were being divided. The British field marshal overseeing the division was actually forced to resign because Mountbatten sided with Indian leaders who felt he was being too fair to Pakistan.
Incredible, isn't it?
But the most glaring example of this bias is how Mountbatten handled the princely states.
Yes. The princely states were theoretically given the choice to join either nation. But Mountbatten actively maneuvered to ensure key states joined India. Take Kashmir, for example.
Okay.
Kashmir was a state with a massive Muslim majority, but it was ruled by a Hindu Maharaja. The demographic logic of partition suggested it should go to Pakistan. But Mountbatten and his team exerted immense pressure and manipulated the accession process to ensure Kashmir ultimately joined India.
It was basically a thumb on the scale.
Exactly. And it permanently destabilized the region.
Which brings us to the most visceral, chaotic result of this 73-day scramble. The actual drawing of the physical borders.
This is the darkest part of the story.
The man tasked with this impossible job is a man named Cyril Radcliffe.
Cyril Radcliffe was a highly respected, brilliant London barrister. He was accustomed to parsing complex legal documents, but he had one rather glaring qualification for this specific job, at least in Mountbatten's eyes.
What's that?
Radcliffe had never traveled east of Paris in his entire life.
Wait, seriously, he had zero knowledge of India, the culture, the geography, nothing.
Absolutely none.
Wow.
But Mountbatten believed this made him the perfect candidate. In Mountbatten's mind, Radcliffe's total ignorance meant he was perfectly unbiased. He wouldn't have any local attachments, property, or prejudices.
So Radcliffe arrives in India on July 8th. He's given exactly 5 weeks to divide 450,000 square kilometers of land and 88 million people.
5 weeks.
5 weeks. And he is locked in a sprawling, sweltering bungalow in the middle of the Indian summer. It is so blisteringly hot that doing actual field surveys to look at the land is literally impossible. So he is forced to sit indoors and use outdated maps and faulty census data from years prior.
The physical and psychological pressure was just immense. Radcliffe suffered terribly from the heat and dysentery. The officials working with him literally had tear-off calendars on their desks, watching the days evaporate.
Just ripping a page off every day.
Exactly. Radcliffe was nominally in charge of boundary commissions made up of Hindu and Muslim judges, but they were so polarized they could rarely agree on a single village. The level of arbitrary decision-making was staggering.
I want to look closely at the mechanics of these decisions, because they weren't just drawing lines through empty fields. Let's take the concept of a tehsil.
A tehsil is essentially a local administrative district, much like a county in the United States or a borough in the UK.
Right. And Radcliffe is looking at these maps, trying to assign tehsils based on religious majorities. But he makes decisions that seem completely illogical unless you factor in political pressure.
Right.
For example, he awarded the tehsils of Gurdaspur and Firozpur to India. These were Muslim-majority counties. By his own mandate, they should have gone to Pakistan. But giving Gurdaspur to India was incredibly strategic because it provided the only viable road access for India to reach Kashmir.
Exactly. Without Gurdaspur, India would have had immense physical difficulty accessing and militarily holding Kashmir. Decisions like that convinced many in the Muslim League that Radcliffe, under pressure from Mountbatten, was rigging the borders to favor India.
And the final piece of this tragic puzzle is what Mountbatten does with Radcliffe's finished work, because Radcliffe actually finishes drawing the borders, the Radcliffe line, just before the August 15 independence date. He hands the maps over.
He did his job in the 5 weeks.
But Mountbatten takes the border award, locks it in his desk drawer, and orders that it be kept an absolute secret until August 17, 2 entire days after independence.
Mountbatten's justification for this delay is one of the most heavily criticized decisions of his career.
I can see why.
He explicitly stated in his reports that he knew the border announcement would cause immediate, horrific violence. He didn't want the bloodshed of the partition to mar the joyous Independence Day celebrations, or more specifically, to stain the narrative of a peaceful British transfer of power.
So he was managing optics?
Exactly. He wanted the front pages in London to show fireworks, not a continent being ripped apart.
So Radcliffe, a man completely unfamiliar with the land, is locked in a sweltering room with bad maps, making life-or-death decisions for 88 million people. And then Mountbatten hides the results just for good public relations.
Yes, and the fallout was unprecedented. Because the independence dates were moved up to secure that Commonwealth deal, there was absolutely no time to set up proper security forces, refugee camps, or administrative frameworks along the new borders.
No infrastructure at all.
None. So when the lines were finally announced on August 17, millions of people suddenly woke up to find themselves on the wrong side of a border they hadn't known existed the day before.
That's terrifying.
The resulting panic, confusion, and horrific communal violence led to the deaths of over 1 million people. 12 million people were displaced in one of the largest, most traumatic mass migrations in human history.
Wow.
And those specific rushed decisions made by Radcliffe, like the Gurdaspur tehsil, are the direct origin of intense geopolitical conflict and military standoffs that persist between India and Pakistan today.
When you look at the totality of what we've covered, the picture is just staggering. We've seen how Mountbatten's arrival in March 1947 took an incredibly complex, delicate withdrawal and accelerated it into a chaotic sprint.
Very chaotic.
We saw how a reliance on personal charm over policy, a gut hunch at Simla that broke protocol, a bruised vanity over a governor-general title, and a calculated desire to keep military bases in the British Commonwealth led directly to the fateful June 3 plan.
And ultimately, that plan directly resulted in the impossible, catastrophic 5-week deadline handed to Cyril Radcliffe.
Exactly.
If there is a core truth to extract from these archives, it is that history is rarely a clean, logical process engineered by detached architects. It is profoundly, tragically messy.
Yeah.
It is driven by the personal quirks, the vanities, the biases, and the hurried compromises of deeply flawed individuals. Millions of lives were permanently altered by men sitting in drawing rooms, using outdated maps, racing against a clock of their own making.
Which brings us right back to that ticking clock we started with. Because when Lord Mountbatten addressed the newly independent assembly on August 15th, he stood up in all his royal finery and said, "There is no time to look back. There is time only to look forward."
A very polished line.
Right. But considering the Radcliffe line was sitting quietly in his desk drawer at that exact moment, completely unannounced, while millions of people celebrated a border they couldn't yet see, I want to leave you with a final thought to explore on your own. Is it ever truly possible for a newly born nation to step cleanly into the future when the very lines of its past were drawn in secret in a desperate rush by someone who had never even seen the land?